Did you know the Battle of Stalingrad lasted 199 days and cost over 2 million lives? This wasn't just any battle. It changed the entire course of World War II. But how did one city break Hitler's army? And why did so many have to die? Stay with us to uncover the shocking truth behind the deadliest battle in history. In 1942, Adolf Hitler, the leader of Nazi Germany, was feeling unbeatable. His armies had already conquered much of Europe, sweeping through countries like Poland, France, and even parts of the Soviet Union. The Germans look unstoppable. But now, Hitler wanted more. He set his eyes on a new target, the Soviet city of Stalingrad. Stalingrad wasn't just any city. It sat on the banks of the Volga River, an important waterway that connected many parts of the Soviet Union. Factories in the city produced weapons and tanks for the Soviet army. But there was something else that made it special to Hitler: its name. Stalingrad was named after the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, Hitler's biggest rival. Capturing this city would be a huge blow to Stalin, and Hitler believed it would weaken Soviet morale. But why was Hitler so focused on this city? Stalingrad was not just a symbolic target, it was a strategic one. It was close to the oil fields of the Caucasus. Whoever controlled Stalingrad could control the flow of resources, especially oil, which was vital for running tanks, planes, and other military vehicles. If the Germans captured Stalingrad, they would cut off Soviet supply lines and deal a serious blow to their war effort. Many of Hitler's generals, however, were cautious. They knew that fighting in the Soviet Union had already stretched their resources. The brutal winter of 1941 had taken a heavy toll on German troops, and the Soviet Red Army had proven tougher than expected. But Hitler wouldn't listen. He wanted Stalingrad at any cost. He believed that taking the city would give the Nazis a huge advantage and possibly bring an end to the war on the Eastern Front. As summer approached in 1942, Hitler ordered his armies to move towards the city. German soldiers were confident. They had already defeated much of Europe and thought Stalingrad would be another easy victory. But this battle would be different. It would be one of the longest and bloodiest in history, and it would change the course of World War II. On August 23, 1942, the Battle of Stalingrad began. It started with a massive airstrike from the German Luftwaffe. Hundreds of German bombers filled the sky, dropping explosives on the city. In just a few hours, much of Stalingrad was destroyed. Fires burned through neighborhoods, factories, and schools. Thick smoke covered the streets, and thousands of civilians, men, women, and children, lost their lives in the first day of bombing. The destruction was overwhelming. Buildings crumbled, leaving piles of rubble where homes and shops once stood. But instead of breaking the Soviet spirit, the bombing only strengthened their determination. Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, gave a chilling order to his army: not one step back. He commanded his troops to fight to the death, to defend every inch of Stalingrad, no matter the cost. As the smoke cleared, German ground forces moved in. They expected little resistance. After all, much of the city was in ruins, and they had won so many battles already. But what they found in Stalingrad was not what they expected. The Soviet Red Army was waiting, ready to defend their city with everything they had. And behind them, Soviet civilians, many who had lost their homes in the bombings, were ready to fight too. Stalingrad was more than just a name. It was a symbol. For Hitler, it represented the ultimate victory over Stalin. He believed that if he could take Stalingrad, it would show the world that the Soviet Union was finished and the Nazis would be unstoppable. But for Stalin and the Soviet people, Stalingrad was everything. Losing the city would be a humiliation, a sign that the Nazis were winning the war. This was a battle of pride, of power, and of survival. The Soviet Union needed to defend Stalingrad not just for strategic reasons, but also to show their people and the world that they could still win the war. The city was a symbol of Soviet strength. Losing it would give the Nazis control over vital resources, cutting off oil supplies from the Caucasus and weakening the Soviet military. But there was something else that made Stalingrad unique. It was a city filled with people who refused to surrender. The Soviet Red Army was determined to fight, but the civilians were just as important. They built barricades, dug trenches, and even joined in the fighting. This wasn't just a battle between soldiers. It was a battle for the very soul of a nation. The German army, or Wehrmacht, had experienced victory after victory. By the time they reached Stalingrad, they were confident that they could crush the Soviets easily. Many German officers saw the Soviet army as weak and disorganized. They didn't expect the fierce resistance they would encounter in Stalingrad. But what they didn't realize was that the Soviets had been preparing for this fight. They had learned from their previous defeats. The Red Army had been reorganized, new tactics were developed, and the Soviet people were more determined than ever to defend their homeland. The Soviet defense of Stalingrad was unlike anything the Germans had ever faced. Instead of a straightforward battle, the Soviets used a strategy of urban warfare. They turned the city's ruins into a deadly maze. German soldiers would move into a street or building, only to find Soviet snipers hidden in the rubble, waiting to strike. The Soviets also used something called hugging the enemy. This meant they stayed as close to the Germans as possible, fighting them in close quarters. By doing this, the Soviets made it harder for the Germans to use their air force or artillery without risking hitting their own troops. It turned every street and building into a battlefield. The Soviets had another advantage. They knew the city better than the Germans. They could use the destroyed buildings, factories, and streets to their advantage, turning each one into a fortress. Civilians also played a huge role, helping to defend their homes with whatever weapons they could find. They weren't trained soldiers, but their determination and courage made a difference in every battle. For the Germans, Stalingrad became a nightmare. They had expected a quick victory, but instead they found themselves fighting for every inch of ground. As the weeks dragged on, the battle became more brutal, and the German soldiers began to lose hope. By late September, the Germans controlled about 90% of Stalingrad. It seemed like victory was within reach, but the Soviets were far from finished. They still held key parts of the city, including factories and supply depots. Soviet snipers, like the famous Vasily Zaitsev, continued to pick off German soldiers one by one. As the Germans pushed deeper into the city, they didn't realize that the Soviet army was preparing a massive counterattack. This battle was far from over. Stalingrad, now a city of rubble and ruins, would soon become a graveyard for tens of thousands of soldiers. The lively industrial zone has become a chaotic scene, filled with ruined buildings, damaged roads, and mountain of rubble everywhere. This made traditional warfare nearly impossible. Tanks had no way to move, and artillery strikes were less effective in the tight urban environment. But the Soviets had learned how to use this destruction to their advantage. Soviet soldiers became masters of urban warfare, using the ruins to set up ambushes, hide snipers, and launch surprise attacks. German troops, used to fighting in open fields and forests, struggled in the narrow streets and crumbling buildings. Every corner held danger, and every building could be a trap. For the German soldiers, it was a nightmare. They called this kind of combat Rattenkrieg, or rat war, because it felt like they were rats trapped in a puzzle, constantly being hunted by an enemy they couldn't see. The fighting was so close and so brutal that it often came down to hand-to-hand combat, with knives, grenades, and even bare hands. While much of Stalingrad was in ruins, some parts of the city were still standing. One of the most important areas was the industrial sector, home to massive factories like the Red October Steel Factory and the Barricadi Gun Factory. These factories, which had once built tanks and weapons for the Soviet army, were now the front lines of the battle. The Germans knew that if they could capture these factories, they would have a better chance of winning the battle. The factories were not only strategically important, but also symbolic. They represented Soviet industry and power, and taking them would deal a psychological blow to the Soviets. But the Soviets fought fiercely to defend these factories. Workers who had once built tanks now picked up rifles to defend their workplaces. Soviet soldiers, along with these civilians, turned the factories into fortresses. They hid in the basements, sniped from windows, and used the machines and equipment to create makeshift barricades. For every German advance, the Soviets pushed back just as hard. Despite the German dominance in numbers and equipment, the Soviets were far from giving up. The Soviet command, led by General Chuikov, launched several small but effective counterattacks, forcing the Germans to fight on multiple fronts. These counterattacks were not large enough to push the Germans out of the city, but they slowed their progress and inflicted heavy losses. One of the Soviets' most successful tactics was their use of snipers. Hidden in the ruins, Soviet snipers like Vasily Zaitsev became legendary for their ability to pick off German officers and soldiers. Zaitsev, for example, was credited with killing more than 200 Germans during the battle. His story would later be turned into movies and books, but during the siege, he was a key figure in demoralizing the German forces. The Germans, in turn, tried to hunt down the Soviet snipers, but the ruins of Stalingrad provided perfect hiding spots. For the Soviet snipers, the ruined city was their playground, and they became experts in using the rubble to their advantage. While soldiers on both sides fought desperately for control of the city, the civilians of Stalingrad were trapped in a nightmare. Before the battle, the city had a population of around 400,000. But now, most of the city's inhabitants were dead, evacuated, or hiding in the ruins. Those who remained lived in constant fear. The bombing had destroyed homes, schools, and hospitals. Food and water were scarce, and there was little to no medical care. Many civilians were forced to live in basements or makeshift shelters, enduring not only the constant shelling, but also the freezing temperatures as winter approached. Despite this, many civilians still helped defend the city. Some worked alongside Soviet soldiers, while others acted as lookouts, scouts, or even snipers. Their bravery and determination to defend their city were crucial in keeping the Soviets in the fight. By October 1942, the German advance had slowed to a crawl. Their initial confidence in capturing Stalingrad had been replaced with frustration and exhaustion. The German soldiers were unprepared for the brutal, drawn-out urban combat. Supplies were running low, and the harsh Russian winter was just beginning. General Paulus, who had once believed in a quick victory, now realized that his army was stuck in a battle of harassment. The Germans had lost thousands of men, and their morale was dropped. To make matters worse, Soviet resistance was getting stronger. More reinforcements were arriving, and the Red Army was learning from its mistakes. Despite the worsening situation, Hitler refused to allow General Paulus to retreat. He believed that the German army could still win if they just pushed harder. Hitler sent more troops and supplies to Stalingrad, but it wasn't enough. The longer the battle dragged on, the more desperate the situation became for the Germans. Hitler's obsession with capturing Stalingrad blinded him to the reality on the ground. His insistence on holding the city at all costs would lead to one of the greatest disasters in military history. While the Germans were struggling, the Soviets were preparing for something much bigger. Soviet generals, including the brilliant commander Georgy Zhukov, had been planning a massive counteroffensive for months. This plan, known as Operation Uranus, would encircle the German Sixth Army and trap them inside the city. But for now, the Germans didn't know what was coming. They were focused on winning the street-to-street battles and holding their positions. Meanwhile, the Soviet reinforcements, including fresh troops and tanks, were gathering outside the city, preparing for the moment when they would strike. As the siege dragged on, both sides suffered massive losses. But the tide was about to turn. The Soviets had survived the initial German onslaught, and their resistance had bought enough time for a massive counterattack to be prepared. The Battle of Stalingrad was entering its most crucial phase, and the Germans had no idea that their worst nightmare was about to begin. Operation Uranus would soon be unleashed, and the fate of the German Sixth Army would be sealed. By October 1942, Stalingrad was no longer just a city under siege. It was a battlefield of unimaginable horror. The fighting was so close, so personal, and so relentless that both sides suffered enormous casualties. This was not like the battles fought in open fields. In Stalingrad, every street, every building, every floor became its own deadly war zone. The struggle turned into one of the bloodiest chapters in World War II. As the battle continued, Stalingrad became a landscape of utter destruction. Bombing raids by the German Luftwaffe had turned the city into a pile of rubble. It was estimated that over 40,000 civilians had been killed in the initial air raids alone, and the survivors were trapped in the ruins alongside the soldiers. The German Sixth Army under General Paulus had seized most of the city, but the Soviets were far from defeated. The Soviet 62nd Army, commanded by General Vasily Chuikov, established their stronghold within the ruins. Chuikov famously said, "For us, there is no land beyond the Volga," emphasizing how determined his forces were to hold the city at all costs. And this determination would make every block the Germans try to seize come at a heavy price. What made the fighting in Stalingrad so terrifying was the close quarters combat. The city's rubble created a maze of ruined streets, collapsed buildings, and underground passageways. Soldiers had to fight in cramped spaces where hand-to-hand combat with knives, bayonets, or even shovels became common. This was warfare in its rawest, most primal form. German soldiers, used to open-field battles and blitzkrieg tactics, were caught off guard by the Soviets' defensive style. The Soviets, knowing the city better than the invaders, turned every pile of debris, every factory, every basement into a death trap for the advancing Germans. Adding to the Germans' misery, the Russian winter had begun to set in. Temperatures in Stalingrad dropped well below freezing, with some nights reaching as low as minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. German soldiers, many of whom were ill-equipped for such harsh conditions, began to suffer from frostbite and hypothermia. The cold weather also made it difficult to move equipment and transport supplies. tanks and vehicles froze, and even weapons became harder to use. Meanwhile, the Soviets were better prepared for the winter. They had the advantage of being on familiar ground, and their winter uniforms were more suited for the brutal conditions. During the siege, the German forces, along with their Italian, Hungarian, and Romanian allies, were pushing their headquarters for more support to protect Army Group B's flanks. The Hungarian Second Army was tasked with defending a 200-kilometer stretch of the front north of Stalingrad, situated between the Italian army and Voronezh. This created a really stretched defense line, with some areas being held by just a single platoon, which usually consists of about 20 to 50 soldiers. On top of that, they were short on effective anti-tank weapons. Zhukov pointed out that the satellite troops were not as well equipped, experienced, or effective as the Germans, even when it came to defense. With all the attention on the city, the Axis forces had ignored the need to strengthen their positions along the natural defensive line of the Don River for months. This oversight allowed Soviet forces to maintain bridgeheads on the right bank, from which they could launch quick offensive operations. Looking back, those bridgeheads turned out to be a significant threat to Army Group B. On the southern side of the Stalingrad front, the area southwest of Kotelnikovo was only defended by the Romanian Fourth Army. Beyond them, a single German division, the 16th Motorized Infantry, was responsible for a massive 400-kilometer stretch. Paulus had asked on November 10th for permission to pull the 6th Army back behind the Don, but his request was denied. He later told his adjutant Wilhelm Adam that there was still an order stating that no army group or army commander could give up a village or even a trench without Hitler's approval. On November 19, 1942, the Soviet Union launched a counterattack that would change the course of the entire war. The operation was called Operation Uranos, and its goal was simple: encircle the German 6th Army and cut off their supply lines. While the Germans were focused on fighting within the ruins of Stalingrad, Soviet forces, led by Generals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, had been quietly amassing troops outside the city. This counteroffensive wasn't aimed directly at the Germans in Stalingrad. Instead, it targeted the weaker flanks of the German army, which were being guarded by Axis allies, including Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian forces. These units were less well-equipped, less motivated, and far more vulnerable to an attack. The Soviets struck with overwhelming force, using over 1 million soldiers, 1,500 tanks, and thousands of artillery pieces. Within hours, the Romanian and Italian forces crumbled under the weight of the assault. The Soviet tanks plowed through their defenses, quickly outflanking the German 6th Army. By November 23rd, the northern and southern Soviet forces had met at the town of Kalak, closing the trap around the Germans in Stalingrad. In just 4 days, the tables had turned. The German 6th Army, once poised to capture Stalingrad, was now surrounded. Nearly 300,000 German soldiers were trapped inside the city, cut off from supplies and reinforcements. This was the beginning of the end for Hitler's forces in Stalingrad. Inside Stalingrad, German General Friedrich Paulus and his officers were in shock. They had never imagined the Soviets could launch such a massive counteroffensive. Now they were encircled, with no way out and no chance for resupply. Paulus immediately requested permission to retreat, but his request was met with a harsh response from Adolf Hitler. Hitler refused to allow the 6th Army to withdraw, insisting that they fight to the last man. He declared Stalingrad a fortress and ordered Paulus to hold the city at all costs. Hitler believed that the Luftwaffe under Hermann Göring could supply the trapped army by air. Göring had promised that the Luftwaffe could deliver the necessary supplies, around 700 tons a day. In reality, they could only manage about 85 tons on a good day, with supplies running dangerously low and winter temperatures dropping. The situation inside Stalingrad grew desperate. The soldiers faced a severe shortage of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Hunger set in, and frostbite became a daily reality. Soldiers froze to death in their trenches or succumbed to disease. Yet despite the worsening conditions, Hitler's order remained unchanged: no retreat. Paulus, a methodical and obedient general, followed Hitler's orders, despite knowing that his army was doomed. As the encirclement tightened, the German Sixth Army became increasingly isolated. The only hope left was a rescue attempt by German forces outside the pocket. But as days turned into weeks, that hope began to fade. In December 1942, a rescue attempt was launched to break the Soviet encirclement and free the Sixth Army. This operation, codenamed Operation Winter Storm, was led by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. His task was to break through Soviet lines and reach Stalingrad with a relief force. Manstein's troops made progress at first, pushing towards Stalingrad through harsh winter conditions. They managed to get within 48 kilometers of the city, but the Soviets, aware of the rescue attempt, threw everything they had at stopping the Germans. Soviet reinforcements, including tanks and artillery, arrived in waves to counter Manstein's advance. Despite initial success, Operation Winter Storm failed. Manstein's forces were stretched too thin, and Soviet resistance was too strong. The German relief force was forced to withdraw, leaving the Sixth Army trapped inside the city. Paulus and his men were now truly alone. Any hope of escape had vanished. The situation inside the encircled Stalingrad pocket, known as the Kessel, meaning cauldron in German, was beyond desperate. With each passing day, the soldiers' physical and mental conditions deteriorated. Starvation became rampant as food supplies ran out. Soldiers resorted to eating horses, dogs, and even rats just to survive. As the German army crumbled inside the Kessel, the Soviets continued to tighten their grip. Soviet artillery bombarded the German positions day and night. The Soviet forces, led by General Chuikov, pushed their way deeper into the city, recapturing block after block. Soviet soldiers advanced cautiously, knowing that the Germans, despite their weakened state, were still dangerous. The Soviet strategy was methodical. They aimed to divide the German pocket into smaller sections, isolating different parts of the Sixth Army from each other. By early January 1943, Soviet forces had cut the German lines into two, splitting the remaining German forces into a northern and southern pocket. At this point, surrender seemed inevitable, but Hitler continued to demand that Paulus hold out. The Soviets, meanwhile, offered terms of surrender to Paulus and his men, but Hitler ordered Paulus to reject any such offer, insisting that the Sixth Army fight to the last man. As Soviet forces closed in, the Germans continued to resist, but it was clear that the end was near. Many German soldiers, sick, starving, and freezing, began to surrender. Soviet soldiers were shocked by the condition of the German troops they captured. Emaciated and frostbitten, many could barely stand. On January 31st, 1943, General Paulus, now promoted to Field Marshal by Hitler, finally made the decision to surrender. Hitler had hoped that by promoting Paulus, he would inspire the general to fight to the death. No German field marshal had ever been captured alive, and Hitler expected Paulus to commit suicide rather than fall into Soviet hands. But Paulus chose to live. With his army in ruins, no supplies left, and his men facing certain death, Paulus surrendered to Soviet forces. On February 2nd, the last remnants of the German 6th Army capitulated. Out of the nearly 300,000 men who had been trapped in Stalingrad, only about 91,000 were still alive. Most of those captured would never return home, dying in Soviet labor camps over the next few years. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. It had been a catastrophic defeat for Hitler and Nazi Germany. The German army had lost one of its most elite fighting forces, and the psychological blow was immense. The Soviets, meanwhile, had shown the world that they were capable of not just defending their homeland, but defeating the once invincible German war machine. Stalingrad marked the beginning of the end for the Nazis, and from this moment on, the tide of the war would turn decisively in favor of the Allies. The Battle of Stalingrad was over, but the cost of the battle was staggering. For nearly 200 days, German and Soviet forces clashed in one of the deadliest confrontations in history. When the fighting finally stopped in February 1943, the city of Stalingrad was reduced to rubble. The streets were filled with ruins, and the dead lay everywhere, frozen in the winter cold. The numbers tell a grim story. Of the nearly 300,000 soldiers in the German 6th Army who were trapped in Stalingrad, only about 91,000 survived to surrender. Out of those captured, less than 6,000 would ever return to Germany, the rest perishing in Soviet labor camps or dying from starvation, disease, or cold. The Germans also lost over 1,000 tanks, 1,800 artillery pieces, and countless vehicles in the battle. For the Soviets, the price was even higher. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers were killed, wounded, or went missing during the battle, and the civilian population of Stalingrad suffered terribly. It's estimated that as many as 40,000 civilians were killed during the German bombardment of the city, with many more dying from starvation and exposure. The psychological impact of Stalingrad on Nazi Germany cannot be overstated. Up until this battle, Hitler's forces had enjoyed a near unbroken string of victories across Europe. The Wehrmacht had marched through Poland, France, and into the heart of the Soviet Union with frightening speed and efficiency. But Stalingrad changed everything. The defeat at Stalingrad was a massive blow to German morale. The 6th Army had been considered one of Hitler's finest, and its destruction sent shockwaves through both the military and the civilian population. Propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels even gave his famous Total War speech after Stalingrad, admitting to the German people that the war was now a struggle for survival. Hitler, too, felt the sting of this defeat. He had personally overseen the decision to hold Stalingrad at all costs, and refused to allow Paulus to retreat when the opportunity was still there. Stalingrad shattered the myth of Hitler's military infallibility, and many German generals began to question his leadership more openly after the loss. Stalingrad wasn't just a psychological blow, it was also a major strategic turning point in World War II. Before the battle, the Germans had been advancing on all fronts in the Soviet Union. Their goal was to capture Stalingrad, secure the oil fields of the Caucasus, and cut off the Soviet Union from vital resources. But after Stalingrad, the German army was on the defensive for the rest of the war. The loss of an entire army at Stalingrad weakened the German military significantly. Hitler had been relying on the 6th Army to help push deeper into Soviet territory. But with its destruction, the Germans could no longer maintain their offensives. From this point forward, the Wehrmacht was forced to retreat, fighting a defensive war as the Red Army began to push westward. The battle also had a profound impact on the Eastern Front as a whole. After Stalingrad, the Soviets began a series of counteroffensives that would eventually lead them to Berlin. The Red Army grew in strength and confidence, knowing that they had defeated the seemingly unstoppable German war machine. Stalingrad became a symbol of Soviet resilience and the turning tide of the war. For the Allies, Stalingrad was a beacon of hope. The victory proved that Hitler could be beaten and that the Axis powers were not invincible. It encouraged the Allies to intensify their efforts on other fronts, such as in North Africa and Italy, knowing that the Soviets were steadily wearing down the Germans in the East. The cooperation between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union would become stronger as a result, paving the way for the eventual D-Day landings and the liberation of Western Europe. The Battle of Stalingrad's impact wasn't just immediate. It would reverberate through the rest of World War II and beyond. The battle marked the beginning of the slow, painful collapse of Nazi Germany. The loss of over 250,000 men and vast amounts of equipment at Stalingrad severely weakened the Wehrmacht's ability to conduct large-scale offensives. From Stalingrad onwards, the Germans would be fighting a defensive war on both the eastern and western fronts. The Red Army, emboldened by their victory, would continue to push westward, eventually leading to the capture of Berlin in May 1945. The battle also had a lasting effect on Hitler's reputation. The defeat at Stalingrad was seen as a direct result of his micromanagement and refusal to allow tactical withdrawals. For the Soviet Union, the victory at Stalingrad was a major source of pride and became central to their narrative of triumph in the Great Patriotic War. The city itself was rebuilt, and for decades, the name Stalingrad was synonymous with Soviet victory over fascism. The battle also strengthened the Soviet Union's position as a global superpower in the post-war world. For the rest of the world, Stalingrad was a symbol of resistance and sacrifice. The lessons learned from the battle influenced military strategy and tactics for years to come. It showed the importance of logistics, morale, and the will to fight, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The battle also reinforced the need for international cooperation among the Allies, something that would play a crucial role in the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. In the end, the Battle of Stalingrad was more than just a military victory. It was a defining moment of World War II. It proved that Hitler's forces could be beaten and that the war's outcome was far from certain. From the ruins of Stalingrad, a new chapter in the war began, one that would lead to the ultimate downfall of Nazi Germany and the shaping of the modern world.